I'm going to be talking about the modern threat landscape and the difficulties we face in vulnerability prioritization. To get things kicked off, though, when we're talking with customers, they're generally looking for four things in their vulnerability management program. And the first thing they obviously want to know is where they're exposed. But then I think the bigger question, and this is what we're really going to dive into quite a bit, is, what do we focus on first? And then, how are we reducing exposure over time? That's usually when you're trying to report up and say, yeah, we're actually doing our job, we're getting stuff patched. And then this one, sometimes it might not apply. I've had mixed reception for this last question up in Ottawa, but I know a lot of my enterprise peers from Toronto are asking, how do we compare? It's all about being faster than the slowest guy, apparently, when you're being chased by a fancy bear. The other thing that I heard, I was in one of the track 2 meetings, and the fellow was talking about shared responsibility and shared risk. And he mentioned this, it seems to be resonating well with everybody, digital transformation. I think we can all agree we're all going through that right now. And it's no longer a matter of disruption, it's a matter of survival. So getting through this digital transformation, I'm guessing a lot of you are from the government, and I know shared services is starting to look at things like cloud. I actually worked for a government project about 18 years ago now, and the thought of putting our stuff up in the cloud at the time seemed quite amazing. The cloud didn't even exist then, so it's great to see that sort of stuff is happening. Now, the one thing that is a big issue when I talk to people is, where are we exposed? And we have this thing that we call the cyber exposure gap. If you're familiar with vulnerability scanning, that's really Tenable's bread and butter. We started off with Nessus. But if you're familiar with vulnerability scanning, everybody's really good at scanning servers and desktops and network infrastructure, the stuff that's not moving around a whole lot. And web apps have been around for a while, I'll give you that. There's lots of web app scans that are out there, but to do a good web app scan nowadays, and the web applications that are out there, they're meant to interact with us. They're not meant to interact with machines. So doing an automated web app scan is really difficult. And each one of these presents its own issue. And just referencing that other talk I was in earlier, they were talking about cloud and how do you secure cloud? It's easy to spin up assets in the cloud, but how do you know it's secure? So one of the things that a lot of the vulnerability management teams are doing, I can speak to my company, obviously, but configuration compliance. So that's something that's out there. But ultimately, what this is saying is, traditional VM is not doing a great job except for these. So there's a gap that's coming out in trying to assess all these for vulnerabilities. And I'm the sales engineer. I don't like to sell FUD. But there's definitely hackers going after all these new assets that are out there. And some of these aren't even new assets. If you look up at the top, the industrial control systems, they're really old assets, but all of a sudden they're connected, and it's possible for hackers to get in there. And even when it's not connected, I won't name names like Stuxnet, but they find a way to get to the devices they want to. But I want to keep everybody awake, so I'm going to ask for a little audience participation. Out of this, how many vulnerabilities do you think were in 2018? Anybody voting for A? Okay, I'll take that as a no. Anybody think 9,300? Oh, okay. How about 16,500? Okay, we got a few hands there. Okay, and then I'm guessing I'm going to get a lot of people saying 22,000. Okay, all right. I did rig this a bit because I know we're in security, right? We all fear the worst. Thank goodness it wasn't that bad, but it was pretty bad. It was 16,500 vulnerabilities last year. So give yourselves a pat on the back if you voted for that. That's still a really big number, though. And what's even worse is 59% of these are considered high or critical vulnerabilities. So that's still 10,000 vulnerabilities. We're not talking about finding a needle in a haystack. We're talking about a pile of needles that you've got to figure out what you have to prioritize first. So where do you start with that? And then the other problem on top of that is, out of those 10,000 vulnerabilities, or out of this 16,000, only 7% of those were actually exploitable. So that means if you're trying to patch all these, you're doing an awful lot of extra work. And when I'm thinking about vulnerability prioritization, nobody actually sets out to say, I want to prioritize all my vulnerabilities today. That's not your goal. Your goal is to save yourself some time and effort. So that's a big thing right there, trying to get from that down to that. And then, more importantly, it was even less that were actually used in cyber attacks. So you could even focus on that 7%, and you're still doing a lot of extra work. Now, this is what we're all faced with, and I haven't been in sales my whole life, by the way. I just joined about 5 years ago or so, and so I got out about 2014, and I kind of feel a little lucky, because it's like a retirement for me. I don't have a pager, and I don't have to do any of the patching, because there's a lot of patching that's out there now. You can see 2017, 2018, and 2019 are right on track for the same level of vulnerabilities. So that's a lot of work. And one of the big issues that we see is, I think you're probably all familiar. Well, you know what? I'm going to jump ahead to one of my other questions. Who here actually does vulnerability scanning? Okay, so we got to go. Now, who are the people that get the vulnerability reports and have to patch? All right, okay, so we got a few of those too. I would like to apologize on behalf of the vulnerability scanners whenever we just threw the report over and left you to your own. But to talk about the vulnerabilities a little bit here, this is an example of document suite. It's got a vulnerability in it that allows arbitrary code to be run. And, blah, 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 memory problems, whatnot. This was given a high rating, 7.8. And I'm not going to bore you with the details. I've been doing workshops on this over the summer. But essentially, this is the scoring that contributes to that 7.8. Now, here's the trick with this. This was one of the top vulnerabilities used in cyber attacks last year. So when you think about it, it really shouldn't be a 7.8. It should be a 10 out of 10. And part of the problem is the CVSS system is, I don't mean to say it so harshly, but it's a little broken. One of the reasons is, if you go back to the scoring here, this, because it's a document viewer, it doesn't require the network. So that means it only gets a fairly low score on the attack vector. And this requires a user to click on it in order for the vulnerability to work. So that also gives it a lower score. And technically, it only affects the document viewer. But in reality, as I said, this should be a 10 out of 10 because we all know documents get sent across the network. So that really should make it a network vulnerability. And as for user interaction, we all know, as much as we tell people don't open those attachments, sometimes things slip and an attachment gets open. So really the interaction should be none because everybody's curious. They're going to open that document. And then in terms of scope change, obviously there is a scope change. It may not be recognized by the National Vulnerability Database, but there is, because otherwise hackers wouldn't be using this. They get into the document viewer, and then they pivot and get into the rest of your environment. And I always say, don't take my word for it. I'm just a sales engineer. I've actually had customers say, well, you're in sales, you lie. I don't take that personally. But here's a white paper from Carnegie Mellon that was published last December. They had a very nice title called Towards Improving CVSS, but essentially the document was why CVSS is broken. And the big thing is CVSS is based on technical severity. But the issue is everyone is using it for organizational risk, and it's not meant for that. And the funny thing is, so this is version 3.0 they're talking about. 3.1 just came out in June, I believe it was, and they specifically called out, we are just technical severity, not organizational risk. So that's an important thing to remember. So I'm going to have just an open-ended question. If you feel that you want to answer, by all means, but what are some of your thoughts on how we can improve this? I don't mean to put anybody on. Yes?
I think a pretty standard thing for any competent security organization that runs scans like this is you're faced with a technical rating.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that that's the risk in your environment. So what we have to do is obviously we can just patch it, because it saves a lot of time. And
Right.
we need to patch it anyway. The second thing is that we'll do what's called a risk reduction analysis, okay, which looks at proximity to the edge and a whole series of attack surface, a whole bunch of factors like that to come up with really what is the real risk.
Right. Right.
Does that make sense?
Oh, it absolutely does. I was going to say, did you see my slide deck earlier? No, so yeah, that's great, and that does sound like a lot of. Do you find it's a lot of manual work, or do you have ways to automate that right now?
It can be automated. It depends on the scale of the environment. But you can certainly triage it by saying, okay, what can be immediately addressed by applying a patch immediately?
Right.
Or it depends on the severity. If it's critical or high, it should be addressed immediately. If it's something lower, then certainly the next patch run.
Right.
But the thing is that leaves you with a subset. And if there's something there that can't be patched for a while, or can't be remediated for a while, now you need to know what the real risk is so that you can deal with it, right? And that's when we apply. So it's only a subset.
It's interesting you say that too, because I've had a couple of customers say, well, we don't really have time to patch, so why should we scan? Yeah. but at least you'll know your organizational risk. That's a great point. Thank you. So talking along those same lines then, so we've been experimenting with something, and so this is called predictive prioritization. Now, this is a name for our product, but I'm essentially just going to talk about the process. But what we're doing is trying to automate those workflows that you were talking about. And especially if it's a large environment, it can be difficult. And the funny thing is, even if it's a smaller environment, it can be just as equally difficult because you may have just an IT guy that's doing security, part of the time. So the big thing is, how can we make that more efficient? So what we've done is taken a data science approach to vulnerability management. And we're leveraging machine learning and real-time threat intelligence. So I'll talk a little bit more about where we're getting those feeds from. And the whole thing is to help you focus your time and resources, because you've got limited time to do things in your environment, obviously. I'm sure nobody can just go in and patch. If you're one of those lucky ones where you can apply all the patches, go for it. Please do it as much as you can, because it's a rough world out there. So in our product, we call this vulnerability prioritization. But really, it's taking the CVSS framework, which was actually pretty good. As much as CVSS bang on it because it's just technical severity, it's not bad. Where they were a little lacking was in the threat score, because the National Vulnerability Database are the people that use the CVSS system, and their best effort. They say that on their website. They're open about it. I mean, there's times there's an example coming up where they took 70 days to put out a score. So you can see they're a little overworked. And the other thing is, because they're doing best effort, they're not getting a threat feed doing daily updates. So that's what we've done with our machine learning model. We take the CVSS impact score and scope, and then instead take in our threat data from various sources and replace the threat score in CVSS. So what we're doing is giving you a similar score, 0 to 10, but with some machine learning intelligence built into it. So it's things like looking at the threat actors that are using this vulnerability. How the vulnerability, obviously it's been made by a manufacturer. How broad is the coverage of that product? If it's I know Microsoft's out there, so don't tell them I'm bashing them. I'm not. But they've got a big product range. Everybody's got Microsoft in their environment. So if there's a Microsoft vulnerability, it's going to be much more severe than if you've got a vulnerability on AIX. So just a couple of examples here. Here's some data science in action. So this is an example of, if you look down here, this is a CVSS 8. So it's a high vulnerability. We rated it a little differently. We considered it a critical, 9.6, but you can see why. And the threat recency on this was in the last week. Threat intensity is high, so there's a lot of people out there doing things with it. And most importantly, probably, the exploit code maturity is high. The age of the vulnerability, it's relatively young, so that's probably why we didn't give it a 10 out of 10. but we're seeing dark web and underground communication on it. And part of that is we're obviously taking in various feeds. Recorded Future is a big partner of ours. We also have our own research team that's looking into this. So that's where you see security research and whatnot. But where it gets interesting is, here's a medium vulnerability. You can see by the CVSS down here. I won't ask, actually. I usually ask how many people actually get around to patching their medium severity vulnerabilities, because I've had customers that are like, we're lucky if we can get to all the highs and criticals. So the mediums aren't even something on their minds usually, but it's sure on the mind of the hackers. This is a 9.4 in terms of criticality. Part of the reason there is the vulnerability has been around for at least a half year. There is some proof of concept exploit code out there. It might be a little difficult for me or your average person to leverage, but the hackers know how to leverage it. And then there's talk of it on various sources, not specifically the dark web, but so that all this gets plugged into the machine learning, and we'll talk a little bit more how that actually works. But so it ends up that this is actually an important vulnerability, even though it's a medium. And then you have critical vulnerabilities that are not actually critical. So CVSS down here, it said this is a critical vulnerability. But if you look at this one, the machine learning model actually said, no, this is just a medium, because the threat intensity is very low. There's unproven exploit code. Age of the vulnerability, it may have been around for a while, and even though the product coverage is high, there's no sources talking about this. And there's probably quite a few hackers around here or pen testers. You have your go-to vulnerabilities if you're a pen tester. You've got 3 to 5 in your toolkit you know really well, and you just use those. So this was probably not one of those vulnerabilities that people were really caring about. Now, to get back to that Recorded Future report, these are the top 5 vulnerabilities from that report in 2018. So these are the vulnerabilities being used in cyber attacks and malware. But if you look at either version 2 or version 3 of the CVSS, most of these are scored as just highs, not criticals, even though these were the vulnerabilities. These were the go-tos for the hackers. Whereas the machine learning actually does come out with values that are much more relevant to that. And the interesting thing, too, is when you get into an automated process of this, where we're updating daily, you get a much more interesting threat score where, when the vulnerability first comes out, nobody's thinking much of it. But as soon as there's dark web information, the machine says, just kick that up. This is an important vulnerability. And as I mentioned, hackers, they've got their go-to. So it may be that, okay, they try this out and they think, it's not going to be actually all that good, so we're going to lower that vulnerability over time. But in this particular example, all of a sudden, it became relevant again, and the dark web kicks back up. Now, when we apply this to all the vulnerabilities, and we did train it on all the vulnerabilities with all the threat intelligence we had, that 60% that are high and critical end up getting shrunk to this little bit over here. You can barely even see the critical list there. And the highs are much more relevant. And I will fully state that, I'm not going to say don't patch these. But if you are pressed for time, these are the ones you want to focus on first. These are going to help keep you out of the news. So let's get back to those 4 questions that I mentioned. So we've talked about, obviously, where are you exposed? Just do some vulnerability scanning. You can find that out. But what should you focus on first? Well, that's what we just talked about. Now let's focus on these last 2. How are we reducing over time, and how do we compare to our peers? And this is where I'm guilty of doing this. When somebody asks, how secure are we, they don't want a vulnerability report of 300 pages long. It's probably one of the reasons why I should, it was a good thing I got out of operations when I did. But, so what we're looking at next is another machine learning method to help prioritize or to help communicate that 300 pages. So the first thing it's going to do is calculate all the risk based on not just the vulnerabilities and the threat intelligence, but also the asset criticality. So getting back to your point, I mean, it's really important to have that asset criticality. Your CEO or ADM's console is going to be much more important than the front desk. Then there's a way that we can communicate all this that's going to be easy to understand for all the upper levels that might not be savvy on vulnerability management. They don't want to hear all the details. And then finally, give you a way to compare against those peers if that's something you want to do. Now, the way we've gone about doing this, of course, machine learning requires a lot of data, and the more data you can have, the better. So over the last 3 years or so, we've gotten a 4.5 petabyte data lake about this. We're looking, because we've got a cloud service, and that may not be obviously something that everyone in this room is interested in, but those who are using the cloud service, we're seeing 1.5 billion vulnerabilities per week. And I already mentioned there's some of those data sources we're bringing in. So we've got 8 third-party data sources. I think it's actually 10 now. They vary. We rate those data sources as they're coming in. So we take in all this vulnerability information, prioritize it, and then add that asset criticality. And we also can add in business context, and I'll talk about how we do that. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about the asset criticality portion. So what we call it is asset criticality rating, but really what this is looking at is the business purpose of that device, the type of device it is. Obviously, connectivity is important. Is this thing connected to the internet? Does it have a public IP or something? Capabilities of it, location, and maybe even some third-party data. And what ends up happening is for all of our assets, we can end up with a way to categorize them automatically. And I had a customer ask me this recently, is it always right? And I will always caveat that with, it's a machine. It's not always ever going to be right. That's why we have this little pencil beside the rating there. So if you want to adjust it yourself, you can certainly do that. But here's an example of how it would go about doing this. In this case, we've got it sees that it's a general purpose device, but because it's doing vulnerability scanning, it's also able to see, hey, this is a mail server and a database server and a file server. So this seems like it might be something important. We're going to kick that up. And I didn't put it right up to a 10 because it's just internal. But if it was external, it would definitely go up higher. And then talking about the business context I mentioned earlier, we have right here the ability to tag. And if you're going to do tagging, definitely have automatic rules to help you out, because if you've got a big environment, it's going to take a long time for you to tag all this sort of stuff. But definitely get in there, like what the business unit is, where it might be geographically located, because as you might be aware, there are certain threats where they focus on a particular continent, and we might never see them here in Canada. So this is an important thing. Get that asset criticality in there. And one feature that we have is the categorization. As I mentioned, it's a 0 to 10. So we're able to say, okay, this is a critical asset, this isn't. But the one thing I wanted to point out is if you're ever doing something like this, if you can't categorize it, it means you're not scanning it enough. So if you're familiar with vulnerability scanning, you can just do the network scanning side of things where you've got the attacker's view, as we call it. But then there's also what we call the owner's view, where you're logging in with credentials and you're seeing exactly the software that's on there. Because if you think about it, a network-based vulnerability scan, I can say, yeah, there's a web server on there and it's vulnerable. But I can't tell you, if I just do a network scan, there's a workstation there and it's got Adobe Flash on it, and if somebody clicks on something, it might use that vulnerability. The only way to see that is through credentialed scanning. Oh. I gotta love technical difficulties. There we go. All right. I gotta stop moving around. I think I'm building up a static charge here. All right, so when we take the vulnerability priority based on threat intelligence and then the asset criticality together, we're able to get a much better idea of what's going on in the environment. Now, I already asked this one, so I'm going to skip over that one. But to get back to the people that have to patch, The other important thing that you're going to want, it's not just a vulnerability list that you're looking for. And this is where I'm kind of apologizing to all the people I ever worked with, where I just threw a vulnerability report over to them and said, go fix this. Because they don't have time. And again, this all comes back to trying to save time. So what you really need is a list of what do I actually do? So with all this model that we've been working on, we also come up with what we call the solutions list instead of just the vulnerability list. So trying to up that game a little bit, making it easier. So instead of your Adobe being vulnerable, we're saying you have to patch it to this version or later. So it makes things much more effective. And then you can see, oh, if I apply this, if I do this thing in my environment, it's going to get rid of 300 vulnerabilities. And that's going to reduce the risk a lot. So what we call all this, with the vulnerability rating, the threat intelligence, the asset criticality, we call this a cyber exposure score. And the way we've done it is, it's like a credit score for your environment. Only really high is really vulnerable, low being very much secure. And it's never a race to zero. As much as it's a great idea, you're never going to get to zero. But it's good to have goals. And in this example, this particular environment's got a medium in terms of its cyber exposure score. And then you can see compared to, say, public services, 728. So doing better than the average public service and doing better than the tenable population as a whole that we're aware of. So good way to rate yourself against your peers. This would be your entire environment. Yeah, all the assets, all the vulnerabilities. But there's, coming up, I'm going to show you how you can break that down by business unit. Yeah. So you can take this same score and then track that over time, of course, so you can see how things are doing. And then getting to that business context. So if you get everything tagged properly and categorized, and that may seem like a big thing if you've got a big environment, but that's where the automatic rules definitely come into play. Then you can say, all right, here's my organization up top. It's got that 601 score, so not too bad. But let's dive into it and see how all my different departments are doing. And you can slice and dice that however you want. So whether it's by geographic location or maybe operational, operational teams or line of business. It's basically your imagination in terms of how you want to tag things and then break down those tags. But that lets you say, okay, well, I'm doing all right across the organization in general. And in this particular example, New York was doing really good, but London needed some work. So it allows you to show where you might need to focus your remediation efforts. And then this is obviously very high level. So this would be, director general or just general manager sort of view. But there's also ways to dig into that data and then see, well, here's all our vulnerabilities by the threat intelligence. And then here's also the asset criticality scores. And so right there, top right, or top left, that's where you want to focus your scores on. So it's really going to make things more efficient for you. And then the last part I think that is really important, a lot of people ask, how are we doing in terms of cyber hygiene? So this speaks to how often I'm actually scanning assets. This is something, we all, one of the reasons I got into sales was I wanted to see how other people were doing it. The last place I worked at, I was there for 5 years, and I really didn't feel like I was making improvement. I know I was, but it sometimes felt like I wasn't. So I wanted to get out and talk to other people and see how they're doing. And it was the same thing everywhere. You're working in your silos. You don't really know how you're doing compared to everybody else. Well, this is a great way to tell you. So you can see in this particular environment where I'm the light blue, I'm actually not doing too bad when you compare me to all the other peers. So I'm scanning most of my stuff at least once a week. There are some things where I could improve. I'm not scanning all that frequently. And then in terms of vulnerability age, I would say I'm not doing too bad here. Oldest vulnerabilities in general is about between 1 and 2 weeks. There's a couple there. Probably I had to accept those risks, but there's a couple there a little older. But yeah, so you get some key insights. It's not just about scanning the vulnerabilities and throwing the list over the operations team. So with that, I'm going to close up here. And if you have any questions, I actually meant to say, if you have any questions during the presentation, please ask them. But we'll save them until now then. So any questions?